devil memorized Psalm 91 before your grandmother was born. He knew it word for word, every verse, every line. And when he stood face to face with the Son of God, on the pinnacle of the temple that Solomon himself built, he opened with it. He quoted it from memory. A psalm. He chose a psalm, not a legal argument, not a political threat, not a display of power. A psalm, and not just any psalm. He chose the specific psalm that the Dead Sea Scrolls community classified as an exorcism weapon, the psalm that Solomon's Levites sang into the foundations of the temple to clear the ground of demonic presence before the workers descended. The psalm that ancient Jewish scholars in the 1st century BCE placed last in a manuscript whose sole purpose was the formal binding of demons. He chose that one, and he quoted it from memory. That is the confrontation I want you to sit with before we go any further. Because if the enemy of your soul memorized a psalm and chose that specific psalm to deploy against the Son of God, of all moments, in all of history, then that psalm is not what most of us were taught it is. And what he did to it when he quoted it, the one phrase he cut, is everything. Let me take you back to the manuscript. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, in the caves above the Dead Sea near Qumran, archaeologists began finding a collection of documents that would change our understanding of the ancient world. We call them the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most people have heard of them, fewer people have read them carefully, and almost nobody outside of academic circles knows about the one called 11Q11. The designation means 11th Cave at Qumran, Scroll 11. Its formal title is the 4 Psalms Against Demons, not a devotional psalter, not a prayer book in the ordinary sense, a formal collection of exorcism texts, documents specifically designed to be used in the casting out of demonic forces. Scholars date the manuscript to the 1st century BCE, before Jesus walked into that wilderness, before the temptation, before any of the events recorded in the Gospels. The manuscript contains 4 texts used for this purpose. Psalm 91 is the 4th, the final one, the climactic binding psalm in a sequence of exorcism documents, and at the introduction to that psalm, Solomon's name appears, not as an author in the modern sense, as an authority, as the one whose framework and whose system of naming and binding gave the psalm its particular power in that context. The Qumran community who preserved this were not fringe. They were the most rigorously observant Jewish scholars of their era. They copied scripture with extraordinary precision. They understood what they were doing. And what they classified Psalm 91 as, in that manuscript, was not comfort literature. It was a weapon, a binding document, a formal declaration of divine authority over demonic forces, used in the most serious spiritual confrontations the ancient world knew how to name. This is the psalm Grace grew up praying. This is the psalm your grandmother recited. This is the psalm you have prayed in times of fear and trouble and illness. And now that you know what the Qumran community classified it as, ask yourself this question. Did the people who taught you to pray it know what it actually was? Let me show you the other layer. There is a Jewish Aramaic translation of the Hebrew scriptures called the Targum. When Jewish scholars translated the Psalms into Aramaic, the common spoken language of the ancient world, they did something the English translations do not do. They named the demons. In Psalm 91, the original Hebrew describes threats in poetic language. Terror of the night, an arrow that flies by day, pestilence that stalks in darkness, destruction that wastes at noonday. To an English reader in the 21st century, these sound like metaphors. Illness, perhaps, misfortune, the various difficulties of human life. The Targum saw something else entirely. Terror of the night in the Aramaic, Shaid Lelaya, night demons, specific entities recognized by name in the ancient world. The arrow that flies by day, Mazikin, harmful spirits, the kind that move in the daylight hours when the mind is occupied and the guard is partly lowered. Pestilence that stalks in darkness, Lilith and companion spirits. A class of nocturnal entities described in considerable detail across the Talmudic literature. Destruction that wastes at noonday, Ketev Meriri, the noon demon. One of the most feared entities in the entire Talmudic tradition, the spirit described as appearing at the height of the day, when the sun is directly overhead and the shadows disappear. The Talmud devotes considerable discussion to this one. The Targum was not making up a dramatic interpretation. It was preserving what the ancient Jewish community understood the psalm to actually mean. When you pray Psalm 91, you are not speaking in generalities. You are addressing a specific taxonomy of spiritual forces in the precise language that ancient Jewish tradition used to bind them. And now, here is the question that has stayed with me since I first read 11Q11. If the Dead Sea Scrolls community classified this psalm as a weapon, and the Targum mapped each threat to specific demon classes, and Solomon's name and authority appear alongside the psalm in a formal exorcism document, then what was the enemy doing when he quoted it? He was not citing a comfort psalm to trap Jesus in a misapplication of scripture. He was wielding the most feared binding document in the ancient world, and he knew every word of it. Now I want to slow down here, because this is where I think we have missed something important. Psalm 91 opens with 2 verses. Most people move through them quickly. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. 2 verses, 11 lines in English. And most of us, if we are honest, have rushed past them to get to verse 3. But in Hebrew, these 2 verses do something remarkable. They stack 4 divine names in immediate succession. Most High, Almighty, Lord, my God. In Hebrew, El Elyon, Shaddai, YHWH, Elohim. 4 distinct names of God, each carrying a different dimension of divine identity, placed one after another before the body of the psalm even begins. El Elyon, God as the Most High, the one who stands above every created authority, every spiritual hierarchy, every principality, every named power in the ancient world, below this name. Elyon is God as sovereign over all created order, visible and invisible. Shaddai, the name scholars trace to El Shaddai, God of the mountain, God of sufficiency and provision. In later tradition, this becomes God as the one who covers and protects. The breast name, some rabbis called it, the one who enfolds and shelters. God not as transcendent judge, but as immediate protector. Kosh, the covenant name, the personal name. The name God spoke to Moses from the burning bush, the one who is, the one who keeps promises to his covenant people. This is not God as abstract force. This is God as party to a specific agreement with a specific people, bound by his own character to fulfill what he has declared. Elohim, God in his fullness of creative and judicial power, the name that opens Genesis. God as judge, as creator, as the one who called everything into being from nothing. 4 names, 4 tiers of divine authority, named in sequence before anything else is said. An ancient scholar of Solomonic tradition, someone who understood how Solomon bound demons through the precise invocation of divine names, would have recognized this immediately. This is a forensic declaration. Before you make any request in this psalm, before you ask for protection, before you claim any of the promises that follow, you establish who is present. You name every tier of divine authority. You declare the full legal identity of the one you are about to address. Every spiritual force that recognized those names, and in the ancient world they all recognized those names, would have understood what was being declared before verse 3 was even reached. The psalm does not begin with a request. It begins with an identification. And Solomon's method, the method preserved in the Testament of Solomon in 11Q11 in the Targum, was always the same. Identity first, authority declared, then the command. The 2 verses you rush past are the forensic opening, the legal declaration that makes the rest of the psalm binding. When you pray Psalm 91 word by word, you do not skip those 2 verses. You dwell in them, you let each name land. Because the enemy who memorized this psalm knew exactly what those 2 verses were doing. Now, this is the moment I've been building toward. Psalm 91 verse 11. In full, in the Hebrew original. This is what the text says. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. That is the complete verse, 11 words in English, 9 in the original Hebrew. Now let me show you what the devil said when he stood on the pinnacle of Solomon's temple. Luke chapter 4, verse 10. his exact quotation, for it is written, "He will command his angels concerning you to guard you." And then verse 11, continuing his citation, "They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Read it again. Read the full psalm verse and then read what he said. "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways." He will command his angels concerning you to guard you. One phrase is missing. In all your ways. He cut it, surgically. 4 words in English, 3 in the Hebrew. He quoted the beginning of the verse, he quoted the end of the verse, and the phrase at the center, the specific phrase between guard you and the end of the sentence, was not in his mouth. Now why would he do that? He did not forget. He had the psalm memorized. He quoted it from memory, deployed it in the most high-stakes moment conceivable against the Son of God himself. He did not stumble. He did not misremember. He cut it deliberately. And to understand why, you have to understand what that phrase means, in all your ways. In the Hebrew, bechol derakecha, in all your paths, in all the ways you are walking. This phrase is the covenant condition. The angelic commission in verse 11, "He will command his angels concerning you to guard you," is not a blank check. It is not universal divine protection, regardless of who you are or where you stand. The condition is, in all your ways. God's angelic protection activates for the one walking in God's ways, in covenant, in obedience, on the path God has declared. The devil removed that phrase because he could not quote it without exposing something he could not afford to expose. To quote, "In all your ways" would be to acknowledge the covenant condition. To acknowledge the covenant condition would be to acknowledge the covenant itself. To acknowledge the covenant would be to acknowledge that he, the one standing there on the pinnacle quoting this psalm, is outside it, permanently, without remedy. He could not say those 4 words, not in that moment, not ever. So he cut them. And in cutting them, he transformed a covenant document with a specific condition into a promise without condition, a blank check. Universal protection, no covenant required. Jump from any height, God will catch you. Jesus rejected it, not with another psalm, with Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16. "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." He was telling the devil, "I know what you cut. I know what the full verse says, and I know the condition you removed is the one you cannot meet. But here is what this means for you tonight. When you pray Psalm 91, and you reach verse 11, when you come to the verse the enemy memorized and chose to quote and chose to cut, you have the opportunity to say the 4 words he would not say. In all my ways, not as a boast, not as a claim of perfection, as a covenant declaration. I am walking in your ways, Lord, not perfectly, but that is the direction I am walking in. The condition is met, not because I have earned it, but because I am in the covenant. The angelic commission is active. That is the phrase the devil removed from the prayer. That is the phrase you put back. Let me tell you about Solomon and the foundations. When Solomon began building the temple, not the walls, not the courts, not the Holy of Holies, but the foundations, the Midrash Tehillim records a specific practice. The workers who descended into the foundations did something dangerous. Not physically dangerous, spiritually dangerous. They were going underground, into the stone, into the earth below the surface of the ground on which the temple would stand. And in ancient Jewish understanding, a tradition consistent with what we find in the Talmud, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the demonological literature of the ancient Near East, the below-ground space was not neutral. It was contested. Spiritual forces gathered in those underground places, in the foundations, in the spaces that would hold the weight of what was being built above. Solomon's Levites sang before those workers went in. They sang Psalm 91, not as background music, not as encouragement, as a formal clearing of the ground, a declaration of divine authority over the space the workers were about to enter. The psalm was sung so that what descended into the foundation was not just the workers and their tools, but the declared authority of every name in those 2 opening verses. El Elyon, Shaddai, YHWH, Elohim. This is why the enemy chose this specific psalm on the pinnacle of this specific temple. The temple was built on a foundation that had been cleared with Psalm 91. The most sacred building in the known world had been consecrated, stone by stone, with the very document he was now trying to weaponize. He knew this psalm the way a general knows the fortifications of a city he is trying to breach. He memorized it because he had to, because wherever it was prayed, wherever it was genuinely, fully, word for word prayed, he could not go. Now I need to bring you to verse 13, because there is a transition in this psalm that most people miss. For 12 verses, the psalm speaks of protection, divine shelter, angelic guard, deliverance from specific threats, the theology of being covered, held within the authority of God against the forces that move in the darkness, and the light and the underground places. And then verse 13 arrives. You will tread on the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. Read that word carefully. You, not God for you, not the angels on your behalf, not the divine protection extended over you from above. You will tread. You will trample. The Dead Sea Scrolls community read this verse not as poetic description of divine victory, but as a commissioning of the believer, a legal transfer of authority from the covenant God to the covenant person. And they were specific about the 4 figures in this verse: the lion, the open frontal adversary, the threat that comes at you directly, in the open, without disguise; the cobra, in Hebrew, Pethan, the deceiver, the one who strikes from concealment; the serpent that does not announce itself, the deception you did not see coming until it had already delivered its venom; the great lion, Shahal, the roaring accuser, the one who makes noise, who stands in the open and accuses, who brings charges against you in the spiritual realm, the figure that corresponds to what the New Testament calls the accuser of the brethren, the serpent, Tannin, the ancient enemy, the dragon figure of Genesis chapter 3, the primordial adversary. 4 specific classes of spiritual opposition, and the psalm does not say God will tread on them on your behalf. It says, you will. Because verse 13 is not the climax of the protection section. It is the beginning of something different. It is where the one who has prayed all 12 preceding verses, who has declared the 4 names, who has addressed each domain of demonic force, who has spoken the full covenant condition, including the phrase the enemy cut, it is where that person receives the commission, not just, you are protected from them, but you have authority over them. This is where the psalm shifts from defensive to offensive. And you only arrive here if you have prayed all 12 preceding verses. You cannot skip to verse 13. It does not carry the same weight if you have rushed past the forensic opening, if you have not spoken the covenant condition, if you have not worked through the specific domains in verses 5 through 10. The commission at verse 13 is the conclusion of a process. It arrives. It does not transfer to someone who jumped to the last page. Solomon prayed it word by word to arrive here, and this is where the psalm shifts its address entirely. Verses 14 through 16, I want you to notice something. For 13 verses, the psalm speaks about God. He will shelter. He will command. His truth is a shield. Third person. About God, describing what God does. Verse 14 changes everything. Because he loves me, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. Suddenly, God is speaking directly, in first person. He calls on me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. 7 promises, in God's own voice, in direct speech. The ancient Jewish tradition read this as the seal of the prayer. After the human declaration, verses 1 through 13, God responds with his own binding commitment. The prayer is a conversation, and the conversation is not finished until God has spoken his side. To stop at verse 13 is to pray half a psalm. If you have prayed the protection verses but stopped before God spoke, if your prayer of Psalm 91 ends before the first-person voice of God, you have engaged in half a conversation. The binding agreement is not sealed until both parties have spoken. The psalm is 16 verses. The human declaration is 13. God's response is 3. The full binding document is all 16. And the seal, the final authority of the prayer, is God's own voice at the end. Solomon prayed it to verse 16. The Qumran community, using it as a formal exorcism text, prayed it to verse 16, and you will not find in 11Q11 any instruction to stop at verse 13 and consider the work done. Now I need to tell you something personal. I was in my late 40s. Doctoral research, a project on Second Temple period exorcism literature, specifically the use of Solomonic authority in demonological documents from Qumran. The kind of research that takes years and produces findings that fit into footnotes in journals that 800 scholars read. I had a high-resolution digital facsimile of 11Q11 on the screen in front of me. I was translating a section of the Hebrew text, working slowly because the manuscript has gaps, the ink is faded in places, and the paleography requires care. I was partway through the introduction to the fourth psalm when I stopped, not because of a difficulty in the text, because I recognized it. I had known this text since I was a child in Lagos. My mother, her name was Ngozi, she had Psalm 91 printed on a laminated card. It was green around the edges from years of handling. She kept it under her pillow. Every night before she slept, she would take it out and read it. In English, in a low voice that I could hear through the walls of her bedroom if the house was quiet. I grew up in a house where my father, a historian of ancient religions at UCL, called Psalm 91 protective folk literature. The kind of prayer, he said, that worked psychologically by providing comfort. Useful for managing anxiety. No different in function from the protective charms that appeared in every culture across human history. And my mother would listen to him say this, and then go quietly to her bedroom and pray the psalm from her laminated card. I had always thought, and I say this with some embarrassment now, that my mother was on the less rigorous side of that argument, that my father was describing what the psalm really was, and my mother, faithful and warm and certain in a way she could not articulate to an academic historian, was doing something that had meaning for her, even if the frame she put around it was not intellectually precise. I was in my late 40s, looking at a Dead Sea Scroll from the 1st century BCE, and I realized I had been wrong. Not about my father. He was a meticulous scholar and a good man. About the psalm. The document in front of me was not ambiguous. The Qumran community who produced 11Q11 were the most rigorous scholars of their era. They copied scripture with extraordinary precision. They understood the difference between a devotional text and a binding document, and they classified Psalm 91 as a binding document, used for formal exorcism, associated with Solomon's authority over demonic forces, the climactic text in a sequence of 4. My mother, in Lagos, praying from her laminated card every night before sleep, she was not doing folk piety. She was wielding the most formally classified exorcism psalm in the Second Temple Jewish tradition. She had no footnote for it. Nobody had told her what 11Q11 said. She had no access to the Targum's verse-by-verse demonic mapping. Nobody had explained to her what the 4 names of God in the opening verses were doing. She had inherited the psalm from her mother, who had inherited it from her mother before that. The chain of women who preserved the practice ran back further than any of them could trace. And the practice itself was correct. They were right about the psalm. They simply had no academic apparatus to explain why. That evening, I went back to my flat near the university, and I called my mother. She answered on the 2nd ring. I asked her, "Mama, where did you learn to pray Psalm 91 like that?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother taught me. She said pray it every night. She said the words push back the darkness." I did not explain 11Q11 to her on that phone call. It was late. She had already prayed, but I wrote something in my research notebook before I turned off the light. The women who preserved the practice were not wrong. They simply had no footnote for what they already knew. Now let me give you the method, not because the method is complicated. It is the simplest thing I have described on this channel, but because Solomon prayed this word by word. The Qumran community prayed it word by word, and word by word is different from rushing through it in 40 seconds, because you already know how it ends. The first thing, stand up. Not because standing is a magic posture, because Solomon's priest stood when praying the morning declaration. Lying down signals rest, sitting signals reflection, standing signals covenant obligation. You are appearing before a king, making a declaration that has legal weight. Stand before you begin. The second thing, read verses 1 and 2 slowly, aloud. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Do not rush past them. Hear each name as you speak it. El Elyon, the Most High, God, above every created authority. You are declaring His sovereignty before everything else. Shaddai, the Almighty, God as protector and shelter. Not abstract power, but immediate covering. H, the covenant keeper. God as party to an agreement with you, the one who has bound himself to keep what he has promised. Elohim, sovereign judge and creator. God in the fullness of his judicial authority. 4 tiers of divine identity, declared in sequence before you say anything else. That is the forensic opening. Let each name land before you move to verse 3. The third thing, at verses 5 and 6, name specific threats in each domain. Terror of the night. Name one thing that has come to your household in the night hours. An illness, a fear in the children, a weight that arrives when the house is quiet and cannot be reasoned away. The arrow that flies by day. Name one visible attack on your household during the waking hours. Something financial, something relational, something at work or in the home that comes openly, in daylight. Pestilence in darkness. Name a hidden threat. Something you cannot see clearly but whose presence you can feel. The thing you cannot fully name yet but know is there. Destruction at noonday. Name something that appears peaceful but is not. The threat that comes wearing a quiet face. The psalm covers all 4 domains. Solomon's priests prayed with specificity, not cover everything in general, but I am naming what is in each domain, and I am placing it under this authority. The fourth thing, at verse 11, speak the full verse, including the phrase the devil cut. For he will command his angels concerning me to guard me in all my ways. Say those last 4 words separately from the rest. Pause on them. In all my ways. This is your covenant declaration. You are not claiming perfection. You are saying, I'm walking in your ways, Lord. The condition is met. The angelic commission is active. Not because I have earned it, but because I am in covenant with you. And the covenant is the condition. Say the 4 words he would not say. Deliberately. Clearly. In all my ways. The fifth thing. At verse 13, do not rush. You will tread on the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. Do not read this as poetry about victory. Receive it as a legal transfer. You are not describing what has happened. You are receiving what is being extended. The authority over the 4 classes of adversarial force, the open attacker, the deceiver, the accuser, the ancient enemy. Say it slowly. Receive it while you say it. Because you only arrive at this verse having prayed the 12 verses before it, having declared the 4 names, having spoken the covenant condition, having addressed each domain. The commission lands differently when you have done the work of the preceding verses. This is where the psalm shifts. From protective to authoritative. Receive the shift. The 6th thing. Do not stop at verse 13. Continue to verse 14. Read God's 7 promises in his own voice, slowly. All of them. Because he loves me, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He calls on me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. 7 promises from God's own mouth. You are not finishing the psalm at verse 13. You are finishing the first half of a conversation. God responds in verses 14 through 16. The prayer is sealed when God has spoken. Do not end the conversation before God has answered. The devil who memorized this psalm knows exactly what it does when it is prayed in full, word by word, all 16 verses. The forensic opening with the 4 names. The specific naming of threats in each domain. The covenant condition he removed, in all your ways, spoken clearly and deliberately at verse 11. The commissioning at verse 13 received, not rushed past. And God's own 7 promises completing the conversation at verses 14 through 16. That is the version Grace's grandmother prayed without being taught the reason. That is the version the women of West Africa preserved through generations of laminated cards and bedtime recitations and the low voices of mothers in the dark. That is the version classified in 11Q11 as a formal exorcism weapon. That is the version that makes demons lose their grip. My mother was right. The women who kept the practice were right. They had no footnote for the Targum's demonic mapping. They had never read 11Q11. They did not know about the forensic function of the 4 divine names or the covenant condition the enemy cut. They knew the psalm worked, and it worked because they prayed it the way Solomon prayed it, word by word. Tonight, stand up. Open to Psalm 91. Take your time at verses 1 and 2. Let each name land. Name your specific fears in the domains of verses 5 and 6. At verse 11, say the 4 words the devil would not say. At verse 13, stop rushing and receive the commission. And do not close the book at verse 13. Finish the conversation, let God speak. All 16 verses word by word. That is what Solomon knew. That is what the Qumran community preserved. That is what the enemy feared enough to memorize, and then surgically cut. Restore what he removed, finish what he tried to stop, pray it to the end.